Dave, I've noticed a lot of red eyes, including my own, around Denver recently. And it's not because Colorado legalized marijuana and everyone's stoned. Well, some people might be stoned. I don't know.
It's good to know that you're not.
I'm not. It's because there is so much smoke in the air. I heard, was it 3 days ago, Denver, Colorado. It was the worst air quality in the history of Colorado.
Right.
And I believe Denver had the worst air quality on Saturday or Sunday of any city in the world that day. And I mean, that's really saying something, because you're talking about places like, I don't know, Mexico City and Beijing, some of the most just polluted, areas in the world. We had the worst.
I'm going to mispronounce the name of the city.
Yeah.
So I'm not even going to try.
Yeah.
But I did hear yesterday, so early week.
Yeah.
We went to second to the most populous city in Mongolia.
Wow.
Which I didn't know. I didn't know that Mongolia actually got the worst air quality in the world quite often.
Yep. Well, it's a list we don't want to be on.
But what's interesting is I'm guaranteeing that air quality in Mongolia isn't because of factories or carbon emissions in Mongolia. It's probably the downwind from China.
Probably. Yeah. I don't know. We do know here in Colorado what's going on. I mean, the whole state is covered in smoke. It's actually been terrible. And this isn't the first time. I mean, this has been a pattern in recent years. Last summer was really bad for many months. Right now, the big problem there are some fires in Colorado and other western states, but the bulk of the smoke is coming from a gigantic super fire out in California.
Right.
And the wind patterns, everything are blowing such that it's coming our way.
Hence my comparison to China and Mongolia.
Yeah, right. That's right. That's right. We're there. California's China, we're Mongolia, right? These things happen. Of course, fires happen in nature, but it also turns out government policies are making these fires far worse than they need to be. In fact, federal policies and California, the state of California, they've made it almost impossible, incredibly cost prohibitive, and the regulatory burdens are such that it's almost impossible to thin out the forest, to do any kind of fire mitigation.
Right.
And so as a result, here's what I know about trees. I am no expert in trees, but I do know this. Trees are going to die.
Mm-hmm.
Trees die. And they either die from disease or bugs or something else, or they get cut down. And the thing with trees is they're a renewable source. You can cut down a tree, and as you're cutting it down, you can plant a new one right next to it. And what happens when we have these huge forests, especially out here in the West, this is a particular problem in the western half of the United States, because in the western half of the United States, half of all the land, I want our listeners to get their mind around this, half of all the land is technically owned and controlled by the federal government.
Right.
In some states, like Nevada, I think Utah is way up there, New Mexico, we're talking 80 to 85% of the land is owned by the government.
Mm-hmm.
And so the policies of the government are the policies of how all this land, what happens on the land and what doesn't happen. So in short, here's why these fires are actually getting worse. Environmentalists have long been pushing, saying, look, trees are really important. And trees are really important. I agree with the environmentalists on the trees are really important for all kinds of reasons, not least of which is through the process of photosynthesis. A tree takes carbon dioxide out of the air.
Right.
And combined with water and sunlight, converts it to oxygen and releases it back into the air, which is good for us.
Yep.
We need oxygen. So we all have an interest in lots of trees. Trees are good things. And so the environmentalists come along and say, trees are so important, we don't want anybody to cut down trees. So you can't cut them down, you can't thin it out, you can't manage the forest. And what happens is over the course of years, in some cases decades, you get all this dead timber. These trees die, they fall down, they're rotting, and you get all this dry brush. And it becomes fuel for these, not just fires, but really super fires, catastrophic fires,
Right.
fires that go from just being ground fires. Once when you're in those big forests, the worst kinds of fires are the fires that get up into the canopies of the trees, because there's a lot of oil and sap, and when that stuff lights,
Yeah.
First of all, it takes a lot of heat. A friend of mine has done a lot of research in the realm of forest fires and how trees burn, and it turns out, like, to start a tree on fire, a living tree, it's actually really difficult. I mean, it's not easy to get a living tree on fire.
Sure.
It takes this enormous amount of energy and heat. And once a tree does start on fire, it's really hard to put it out. And that's when you get these devastating fires. And so the environmentalists, in a way, are shooting themselves in the foot. They say, we don't want bad things to happen to the tree, so we're going to create these policies that make it impossible to cut down, to thin out the trees. The result of their own policies are forest fires that are far worse than they've ever been, and the forest fires burn down all the trees,
Right.
the dead trees, the living trees, right? And in the meantime, they're spewing all kinds of terrible things, including large amounts of carbon dioxide into the environment.
You were talking about that, and it was making me think, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. I was at the soft opening of the new Red Leg Brewing Company in Colorado Springs.
Okay.
And they have this beautiful patio, and it's right at the foot of Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs.
Yeah.
And so for those who know it, but you could look up on the ridge and you saw all of the dead trees
Right.
that were left over from the big fire that was up there 2 years ago. That was caused by us, right? It was caused, but it would have been a much less devastating fire had our policies about clearing out things like beetle kill pine.
That's right.
Right. And what's crazy is there's so many uses for things like that, right? If we went out and we cleared all of that out, we always say the free market loves absence, loves opportunity.
Yeah.
The free market has found ways to use beetle kill pine
That's
to
right.
do other things. In fact, there's a ski company here in town that makes skis exclusively out of beetle kill pine. So, but they're not allowed to go and take all of these pine, cut down the dead beetle kill pine trees, and they just go right up and smoke.
Well, and here, this touches on a bigger theme that we've talked about on this podcast. We've certainly dug into really deeply in some of our case studies for our chapter members and our digital subscribers. And that's the whole notion of regulations and looking at the actual results of
Right.
regulations versus just the publicly stated intentions of these things. And, there's this view that if you don't have regulations, then human beings are going to screw up everything, screw up the whole world, and hurt each other in the process. I'm even thinking, even in the forms of little kids' books, there's a Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, and the whole theme of The Lorax is what people want to do is destroy the forest, cut it all down. And it's basically a celebration in little, Dr. Seuss fashion of government regulation is going to save the forest. And yet it turns out many decades ago, business owners figured out all on their own, if you want to run a business that requires trees, lumber, whatever it is, maybe you have a lumber mill or something like that. Well, if you cut down all your trees, you've just really screwed yourself. Your business is, you don't have any more trees.
Right.
And so out of their own self-interest, business owners, property owners started figuring out, okay, it takes, say, 7 years for a tree to go from a little sapling up to an adult tree that can be harvested. And they would build into their business plan, I need enough land where I can divide it into 7 sections. And then each year, I'm going to harvest one of those sections and plant new trees. And the section next to it, those trees will be 6 years old. And the section next to that, those trees are 5 years old, right? And so the point is they're constantly renewing, and then they can design those forests in ways. They can do mitigation so that the trees aren't so close together and they don't have all the dead timber and dead brush. So even if a fire starts in a managed forest, and it does happen. You can still get fires in a managed forest.
Mm-hmm.
They're not nearly as devastating, and they're not. They can be contained easier, and they don't dump so much toxins out into the world.
The irony in everything you just said. First of all, Dr. Seuss writes a book advocating for the protection of the forest, for regulatory protection of the forest.
Right.
And now Dr. Seuss has been canceled. So
there's some irony there.
There's that irony. And then there's also the irony of, and maybe this is a little more personal for me. A lot of people don't know this, but growing up Jewish, a big thing for us is planting trees in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
There is a massive movement. There has been for 50 to 70 years.
And is that a religious phenomenon, or is it simply a necessity that Israel's kind of a desert and there aren't many trees, so let's plant trees?
It's a little of both.
Okay.
There was an understanding that they needed to create trees because it helps with air quality and it helps with with the environment as a whole. You create photosynthesis. You also, it adds more resources available to the area.
I would also think having some shade in a desert like Israel isn't a bad thing.
Which, speaking of, and this is a tangent, but there was that story turned into a movie called The Spy. I think it was either on Netflix or Amazon Prime.
Okay.
Sacha Baron Cohen stars. It's a true story about an Israeli spy, and I won't ruin it. But trees play a major role.
Okay.
In that. It's a great story. And he won some real awards for it.
Okay.
It's not your typical Sacha Baron Cohen being a moron walking around trying to disrupt people. It's a serious role. Anyway, I don't hear about Arabs in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. I don't hear about Arabs in Jordan organizing international campaigns to plant trees in those desert communities.
Right.
But yet these things that the left claims to stand for, that the progressives claim to stand for, it's science. We need to protect the forests. But yet Israel becomes the enemy. So a little bit of a personal.
I am going to throw out a challenge. I would love to see if any of our listeners know of any graduate students in school right now, in college, either in the social sciences or, for that matter, even in some of the related physical natural sciences. I would love to see some comparative research on trees in a place. Take Israel and compare it to some of the, compare it to Libya.
Right.
Natural trees that grow there. I'm assuming there aren't many. I don't know this for sure. I'm just guessing. And then the numbers of trees that have been planted. And it's some sort of, comparative study. Wouldn't that be a great thing to just show off to the world?
Yeah.
If it turns, because my hunch is the Israelis are planting a bunch of trees and the Libyans probably aren't planting any trees.
And the best part, it's all been done by private organizations.
Right.
What's happening in Israel and all of the development and the planting of trees has all been done by private organizations.
Well, and that brings me to a story I wanted to include before we move off of this, the topic of fires. And this is one of these topics. It comes every year, every summer. We bump back into the subject because the skies are filled with smoke. So, good friend, someone I've known a long time, he had this dream of building a house, moving to Colorado and building a dream house up in the mountains. And he did this. Mm-hmm. He was a successful business guy, sold his business, built his dream house, and it's kind of on top of a small mountain. And as he was building his house, he was there surveying around, and he realized, wow, there's a forest around him, these huge trees. If this thing catches fire at the bottom of the hill, the fire is just going to race right up and destroy everything, and everybody's going to die, and it's going to be terrible. So in his typical way, he kind of threw himself into the study of forest fires. He wanted to know what could he do to protect his property, protect his family. And he was going to, there were these fire institute seminars. Like, he really got into, there's a whole science of forest fire. And he came up with a very elaborate, detailed plan of fire mitigation. And he was showing it to some friends, and they loved it. And all of a sudden, he found himself giving little presentations to some neighbors. And then he would travel to some of the local mountain communities, and He bought a projector and a screen, and he was giving these show, and he was showing if you mitigate, if you only have certain number of trees, per yard, and you get rid of the dead timber and all this, you can really reduce the threat of fire. And a representative from a big national homeowners insurance company was in one of these presentations, went up to him and said, "This is great work you're doing. Our company would be interested, because if communities adopt your mitigation, we can lower their homeowners insurance because there's a much less risk of devastating, catastrophic forest fires." So there he was, private citizen, working with a private business. They were going around teaching people how to protect themselves. And you know what the biggest obstacle, what their biggest pushback came from? The United States Forest Service. The United States Forest Service showed up and said, "We haven't approved your program. We haven't approved any of this." And my friend, his response was, "Damn right you haven't approved it. That's why we're doing this, because your policies lead to terrible forest fires. We're actually trying to solve the problem that you guys in the government have created."
Right. It goes back to the ongoing problem of bureaucrats who know so little about what they're talking about, and just setting rules that make them feel good, sound right, get people excited, or make people feel emotionally better about what they're doing.
And of course, there's a power element too, right? That's their source of power. When those bureaucrats from the United States Forest Service said, you can't do this. You can't teach people how to do fire mitigation on their own property and clear off some of the dead wood. You can't do that. It reminds me of, there's a great scene in, this is one of my favorite movies. I think I've mentioned it before. The Dallas Buyers Club has Matthew McConaughey in it, and it's based on a true story. I actually just learned this week that movie was financed by some business guys in Texas. Matthew McConaughey's from Texas. He couldn't find anybody who would. It was his idea to make this movie, and he couldn't find the funding for it. And he went to his friends, these business guys, and they funded him. And I have relatives who work for these guys in Texas. They're in the energy industry. Anyway, there's a great scene in that movie, Dallas Buyers Club, where the main character, played by Matthew McConaughey, he's got AIDS, and he's trying to get stronger and get healthier. And so he's taking vitamins and supplements and all kinds of things from around the world. And there's a scene where representatives of the FDA are standing there and they're like, "You can't take that stuff. We didn't approve it." And he says, "Screw you. This is my life.
Right.
If I want to try something because I think it might help me, who are you to tell me that I can't try a supplement or a vitamin, right, to help me?" And it's that phenomenon of government control, government trying to plan these things that free people should be taken care of, whether it's the Forest Service trying to manage forests that it doesn't really have an interest in managing, as opposed to private property owners who actually care what happens on their property, or it's some government entity telling people what medicines they may or may not take, or in some cases what they have to take, like the FDA or increasingly the agency that's in all the news these days, which is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which was added, I think, just within the last 15 years or so.
And isn't it interesting that they add "and prevention," because that speaks directly to the progressive mindset, right? Right. The proper purpose of government is no longer to protect private property and to protect people's private property. The proper purpose of government now is the prevention of potential harm.
Right. Prevention of disease.
Right.
Prevention of getting sick.
Well,
we're going to make sure you're healthy, Dave.
But in doing that, they're actually admitting the core fundamental idea of government that they don't want to admit normally.
Yeah.
And that is that human life, that your body and your life is and your health is your property.
Right.
Which we've been talking about in our chapter meetings for the last
what they're saying
couple of weeks.
It's their property. It's the government's. The government's basically saying your life, your health, that's us in the government. It belongs to us. We're going to make sure you don't get a disease.
Sure. I mean, they're saying we're going to prevent it,
Right.
But they're also recognizing that they are trying to control property. They are also recognizing that it is property.
Yeah.
And I think that was the point I was trying to get to, was they are actually recognizing that your health and your body, that's property that they have to take care of.
That's right.
And that's part of the progressive mindset.
The CDC views your body kind of the way the U.S. Forest Service and the whole Department of the Interior views, national forests.
Well, so think about that for a second. We talked about this, 2 months ago, intent versus reality.
Yeah.
What is the intent of a law? What is the intent of a regulation versus the actual result?
Yeah.
And when you think about it in those standpoint, and you look at all of the failures of the government has had, great intent, they had everybody's best health and best life in mind, and they fail every single time.
And that's before we move off the subject of fires. That's the big point we need to make. The entire western United States right now is covered in smoke, choking, terrible smoke.
Yep.
We have worse air quality than anywhere else on planet Earth right now. We are spewing amounts of toxins and things like carbon dioxide and other things. More of that's going into the air than all the cars in the United States combined.
Right.
Why is this happening? Because of government policies that were adopted with good intentions, right? By people who said, well, we care about the forests. Therefore, we're gonna pass these policies, say you can't cut down trees, you can't do mitigation, because we care about, that's our intention. And look at the results. The results are these catastrophic fires that burn out of control, in some cases for months. I mean, it's not just days or weeks. In some cases for months, they can't contain these fires because they're so big, they're so hot.
The other funny or ironic part in all of this, and this is just a little side tangent, but these decisions are being made really in combination of two groups, right? You've got the federal and state regulatory agencies that are monitoring forests and trees and everything else in California, and we all know, right? This is this super fire that is blowing smoke east, and that's what's coming into all of these states, and it's happening with elected officials, right? It's this highly skewed one-party rule in California, led by Gavin Newsom, who's doing that, and I laugh because I think back to an article. I think this was mid 2019. Trump was starting to get serious attacks. This was pre-COVID. They're looking for ways to attack Trump, to get him out of office.
Yeah.
And the website The Independent, which is actually British based, so that adds a little twist to all this, but it was a New York reporter who grew up in Paris. So we've got the whole spectrum
very cosmopolitan here, right?
We have this woman who's from Paris, who lives in New York, who writes for the British website The Independent, writing an op-ed and getting support from the New York Times, getting support from the Washington Post, that other countries, citizens of other countries, not that don't even live here, should start getting to the right to vote in United States elections. Because
the United States has an influence around the world.
Exactly.
So maybe people in France and England and Somalia and Libya should be voting in U.S. elections, right?
She made the argument, and this was in the very first paragraph.
Yeah.
We consider the president of the United States to be the leader of the free world, which that opens a whole can of worms that we can discuss in another time. But she says if the president of the United States is the leader of the free world, then shouldn't the entire world get to vote on who the president of the United States is?
So I'm going to throw out a suggestion. Let's take her premise. Let's adopt it and say, okay, people who are influenced by the actions of others get to vote in those other elections. So the actions of California, the forest policies of California and the environmental policies there affect the whole entire western United States, because they're blanketing us in smoke. So we should be voting in their elections.
Right. Let's take that even a step further. It's not even just us, right? The amount of CO2 being put out by these fires, being put off by these fires, are actually creating climate change affecting the entire world.
There you go.
So maybe people in Russia or Ukraine or India or China.
We have friends and people we work with in Colombia, right? The country of Colombia. They should be voting in California elections, right?
So Gavin Newsom's now we had Andrew Cuomo resigned this week, finally, and Gavin Newsom's up for repeal. And maybe people in Colombia, maybe people in India, maybe people in Italy should get the right to vote on whether or not Gavin Newsom should get to remain as governor of California. How would Nancy Pelosi feel about that?
Yeah.
If somebody in South America was voting on whether her nephew got to stay in office.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. There's a connection there. That's
right.
I forgot about that.
It's the Pelosi political crime family.
Yeah, that's right. But it's absolutely true, and so when progressive environmentalists say, hey, we just love the earth. We're not trying to hurt anybody. We just want to protect the trees, and we want to protect Mother Earth. And that's a subject. There's widespread agreement. I too want to protect trees, and I want to protect that. I don't want to destroy the place where we live. But they adopt these policies that go far beyond their personal choice. It controls what other people may do and may not do, and it leads to disastrous results that we can see on the nightly news in the form of these fires.
When you go back to your example of your friend on the mountaintop, why should he have to go to the government to have the right to protect his personal property?
Yep.
Right? If he's got a tree right next to his house, and he says, you know what? It's a little too close for comfort for me. I would like to create a 30-yard barrier,
right,
where there are no trees within 30 yards of my house. I live with a forest all around me.
Right.
There's no houses close by me. I can see the trees. I can have it, but I want a yard, and I want to know that my house is safe from forest fires, or safer.
At least give me a chance to defend my property if fire comes my way.
Right. I want the right to protect my own private property. And the government says no.
Right.
You talked about this in the last case study, when you did your video for the case study. The entire idea of private property has been flipped on its head. We have now gotten to a point where the government decides how to protect your property.
That's right.
The government decides what is your property and what can you do with it, versus this is my property. This is the right way that I want to take care of my property. This is how I want to take care of my body, my mind, my health, my car, my house, my whatever. And the government can get involved as long as they're not infringing on that right.
Dave, your comment reminds me of an important and subtle use of language in our modern political vocabulary. And I want to bring this to the attention of our listeners, because it might be useful. It's a useful tool. The word to pay attention to is that word allow.
Right.
The way it gets used in conversations very often is, well, should that person be allowed to do this or do that? Or should that group be allowed? Should property owners be allowed? And I want our listeners to think through, what's the real premise there? When someone says, well, that homeowner should not be allowed to cut down that tree right next to his house. When they say shouldn't be allowed, who's doing the allowing?
Right.
And the answer is, well, the government, those in government. So what's the real premise? The real premise of that statement, the homeowner should not be allowed to cut down the tree. The real premise is that property really belongs to the government. And the homeowner is really a kind of tenant, a kind of serf, a kind of peasant that the government has allowed to live on that property, maybe build a house on that property. But it's really the government's, and the government's going to decide what happens on that property and what doesn't happen on it. It's the opposite of real property rights, where someone says, this is my property. I will build the kind of house I want to build. I'll cut down the tree I want to cut down.
I mean, the truth is we have completely reverted back to 1775 and before.
Yeah.
Right. We have reverted back to
feudalism.
The king is the landlord. Right. We've talked about that in the past. That's where that word comes from.
That's right.
The king is the landlord. We are merely tenants.
That's right.
Taking care of the king's land. We are merely tenants taking care of the king's property.
Throughout the Middle Ages, throughout Europe, the kind of regimes historians tend to call this feudalism, the feudal regimes. And in a way, the defining characteristic of those regimes and at that time is that there was only one real property owner, the sovereign, the king. And all the land belonged to him, everything on the land, because the land was the foundation of his political power. He got to control what happened on the land, including if a woman gave birth to a child, and it didn't matter whether she was a foreigner or not. If a child was born on the soil owned by the king, that child had a lifelong allegiance to the king, irrevocable.
Was subject.
Was
to the
subject.
king.
Was what they used to call a natural born subject. Child was born on the king's land, then that kid, for the rest of the kid's life, is a natural born subject of the king. And when we look at regulations surrounding property use, including these kinds of environmental policies and regulations, there's a lot of similarities to those medieval feudal kind of regimes.
Well, and I think we need to continue to acknowledge, and I hope we've done this a few times before, and I know we'll continue to, but we have to acknowledge that that's why the majority of Americans who favor freedom, that's why they're upset. This isn't about Joe Biden specifically. I know people make jokes and people say things and all of that, whether it's Biden or it's Cuomo or it's whatever else. The real reason people are upset is because they now are realizing they live in some kind of new serfdom. They live in a new type of feudal scenario. And that's why people get so upset when Barack Obama over the weekend has a massive party in his $14 million Martha's Vineyard mansion that the guy has never worked in the private sector in his life. He's never done anything productive for people. He's never built anything or created anything that's productive. And he was able to go buy a $14 million house. Yeah. And while they're shutting people down, and while they've been saying for 2 years now almost, you can't have funerals and you can't have birthday parties. He scaled back his birthday from 750 guests to 435. Right. And then told everybody, but my rule is you can't take any pictures. And Erykah Badu, who was DJing, took a couple of pictures of the food spread, not even of people, the food spread and her DJ setup. Yeah. And he forced her to take them down. Yeah. Can't let anybody know what we're doing, but we're going to violate the rules. And then over the weekend, Rashida Tlaib was at a wedding, no mask, having fun. Right. We've seen it with AOC. We've seen it with Tlaib. We've seen it with Obama. We've seen it now with Cuomo. We've seen it with all of these guys.
One of our own members, one of our guardians in the Vino Veritas Society, he goes to Sturgis every year. And so I saw he put up something recently that shows a great big crowd at Sturgis. He said, "Don't worry, we're all just here to celebrate Barack Obama's birthday."
It's true. I mean, but it's this idea of rules for thee and not for me.
That's right.
That was the very foundation
of
a monarchy, of an oligarchy, of a pharaoh, of a dictator.
And on that point, we've mentioned this before, but it's such a big thing. This is worth driving home again and again, just how radical and revolutionary the American founding really was in so many ways. We do a big deal at the Vino Veritas Society. We talk a lot about, for example, the whole subject of slavery, how the American founding ignites this unprecedented, greatest anti-slavery movement in history. And it's true. And that is arguably the greatest accomplishment of the American founding. But there are these other monumental, gigantic things right in the United States Constitution. The Americans put in there no titles of nobility. Right. There are no kings or queens or princes. Your father can't bestow on you some royal title that gives you authority. Right. No, we're all equal citizens under the law. The Americans create the first regime of religious liberty. We've talked about that. We've talked about George Washington's famous letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, and how there was no model for that. There was no precedent. It opens up this new path of liberty that is wide and deep and rich and beautiful. And among those accomplishments, I would put in there property rights, creating the first regime that said, we take property seriously, and we're going to do everything we can so that laws protect property rights. That's actually your property. What happens to it is up to you. You chose.
Right.
It doesn't belong to us in the government. It doesn't belong to your fellow citizens. If your fellow citizens want to change what's happening on your property, they're free to offer some money to you and buy it from you. But short of that, it's yours and you do with it what you want. And if you use it in an irresponsible way and you hurt somebody else, we were talking about cutting down trees. Say you cut down too many trees and you create a landslide, and the landslide, right, damages your neighbor's house. Well, your neighbor can sue you, and you got to make that neighbor whole for the damage you caused, right? And that kind of arrangement tends to cause people to be sort of thoughtful and careful about what they do with their property. But that idea of property rights enshrined in law was this tremendous step forward in the story of human liberty. For those who say we want progress, that was one of the greatest leaps forward in human progress, protecting property. And what has been happening for the last 150 years under the influences of progressivism is we're actually regressing back to a kind of feudal state where government owns everything and tells us what we're allowed and not allowed to do.
I think it's worth at this point also making the connection to slavery, right? There's very little difference. Yes, there can be differences in how you base slavery, how you determine slavery, all of those types of things. But a king lording over his subjects and telling them, you have to do this with your land, you have to give me this money, you have to do A, B, C, D, X, Y, and Z, or else you're going to end up in prison, you're going to end up beaten, you're going to end up beheaded, I'm going to put your head on a post out in front of the castle.
Right.
That's slavery.
That is slavery.
That is slavery. By moving closer in that direction, all of the work that we did in the United States from 1776 or before, right? The thoughts, the ideas, the kernels, we talk about that some of them starting as early as 1727 in Franklin's Leather Apron Club.
Yes.
All the way through the 13th Amendment. We're backtracking.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to put it this way. The great accomplishment in terms of ending slavery, if you had to point to one thing that kind of a monument, it would be the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That amendment prohibits legalized slavery throughout the United States, period, right? And so there's the monument. That's what we achieved. And what has been happening, progressives have been repealing the 13th Amendment, not formally, informally, over the last 150 years.
Yes. Slowly
chipping away at the 13th Amendment. And the way they're doing it is they're creating slave ways of life, a little sliver here, and then they add a layer, and then they add a layer. Other people telling us what we're allowed to do, what we must do. That's slavery. And so we're really, the progressive movement is a movement to repeal the 13th Amendment slowly and subtly and without being honest about it.
And the most amazing part about it is they used the same justification before the 13th Amendment as they did today. Science. The science told us. They used eugenics,
yes, they did.
Back in the days of black slavery in the United States, they used eugenics, and they said the science tells us these people are inferior. They're only good for one thing, and that's what it is. Today they're saying the science tells us you can't do that. The science tells us if you do that, we're going to hurt you.
Yep. It's absolutely true. The defenders of slavery, and there were many, and they were well-read, well-spoken. They were an impressive lot of people. And that was one of the main arguments they made was abolitionists, they said. Abolitionists are at war with nature. They hate nature because they said science has revealed that within nature there's a hierarchy of the races. By nature, some races are superior and other. And so these abolitionists who want to get rid of slavery, they hate nature. They're at war with the natural world. And we see this all over. I mean, we saw it. This is happening right now. We mentioned a little bit ago the Centers for Disease Control,
and prevention.
And prevention. That's right. And it's in the news because there's a regulation that they've issued. It's highly problematic. It is causing a lot of damage. It's highly unconstitutional. It's a moratorium. It's a freeze, a hold on property owners evicting tenants who don't pay their rent.
Right.
And there's so much to say about this. First of all, the Supreme Court just recently, a few weeks ago, rightly decided this is unconstitutional, but it was supposed to expire. They decided this mid-July, and the moratorium was supposed to expire at the end of July. So they thought, it's 2 weeks, it's just going to go away. Well, it didn't go away. The Biden administration and the CDC is part of the Biden administration. They've extended it now, I think, into October. So it didn't just go away. But what it is it's a gross violation of property rights. Suppose you save up your money. Maybe you get some money, some friends loan you some money, or some investors come in with you, and you put all this capital into apartment complexes.
Right.
And this is going to be your business. You're going to buy these buildings, rent out the apartments, and you're going to make them nice. You sink in a lot of capital. You put in new carpet, and you get everything painted, new windows, and it's beautiful. And you want to rent these things. And all of a sudden along comes the federal government and says, those people renting don't have to pay you. And when they don't pay you, you may not kick them out. You will go to jail if you kick them out. Oh, and by the way, Dave, you have to pay all the utilities. You got to pay the electrical bill and the water bill and all those things, even though you're not collecting any rents. And so this is crushing people. There are people going broke right now because they can't collect rents. That's how they pay their bills. It's a gross violation. And it points to this whole subject of slavery. It points to just how unprincipled and limitless the modern regulatory agencies are. So Congress created the Centers for Disease Control. And I want to share with you a brief story about its origin. And then they passed another law saying that giving power to the Centers for Disease Control and the U.S. Surgeon General, they are authorized by law, not by the Constitution, but by statutory law, to issue regulations binding on citizens to do anything they think is necessary to prevent or mitigate the spread of communicable diseases. So think about that. It's basically an open, it's a blank check. Yeah. They can command us to, they could command us to stay in our houses, or they could command us not to go in our houses, prohibit us, or whatever they think is necessary for the health and safety of Americans. And yet nobody's elected anybody at the Center for Disease Control. The agency itself has no constitutional justification. It is part of a federal department. The executive branch consists of 15 departments, one of which is the Department of Health and Human Services, which has no constitutional foundation, right? So the entire federal department is unconstitutional. The Centers for Disease Control is unconstitutional. The law that Congress passed giving the CDC this authority is unconstitutional. And then the moratorium that the CDC issued is itself unconstitutional.
So you mean James Madison didn't look back at the plague like 200 years earlier, however long ago it was earlier, and say, we don't want that to happen. I'm going to create an agency in the government to make sure that we don't have another plague in the United States.
That's right. And the story of the CDC itself is it's so revealing about just government creep, how these things creep and grow and expand. The CDC has its origins in World War II, which was a global war, and it included fighting in hot tropical locations. And one of the big problems was malaria, sending a bunch of U.S. soldiers to places where there are mosquitoes carrying malaria. And at that point, we didn't have a cure for malaria. So there's a federal program that begins within the Defense Department to study malaria. How can we solve? And they set up their base in Atlanta, Georgia, because in the American Southeast, malaria was a chronic problem.
And you have the most mosquitoes and
absolutely right. Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Florida. Malaria was an ongoing problem. So that we'll study malaria there, come up with ways to protect right? Protect our soldiers so that the soldiers fighting overseas and, in tropical locations in World War II, we can try to protect them. All that was done under the Defense Department as part of the war effort, a temporary thing. That becomes it went through several different names. I think it was a Center for Communicable Diseases or something like infectious diseases. It's much later when they get the modern name, Center for Disease Control,
Right.
and then and prevention in the 1990s. And now it is this.
Was that Fauci?
Probably. And now it's this sprawling federal bureaucracy that now has statutory legal power to command citizens what they will and will not do with their own property and possibly with their own body. I think
Right.
I think that as soon as the FDA gives full approval, I think that's going to be the next step. You must put this into your body or we're going to punish you somehow.
Right. I wanted to make sure you got to tell that whole story, but I do want to take a step back to two things you talked about.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw them both out so you can help me get back on track with them if I lose one. But one was we were talking about the role of slavery.
Yeah.
Right. And the other was what's happening with all these condo home owners, the ones who are doing rentals who are
right.
now
Can't collect the rent.
Can't collect their rent.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's two interesting stories happening simultaneously. First of all, on the slavery topic, we talk about how sort of this demand on what you do with your property is slavery. And it's slavery the same way we've talked about when a slave in the South in, 1790 was being whipped.
Yeah.
It was wrong because they have natural rights.
Correct. That slave has natural rights.
Right?
They're being violated.
So if we have natural rights, if we have
yes.
this right to our property,
yes,
then any of this, what you just said, that the CDC is likely going to force this, it's inherently wrong. It can't be.
That's right.
It has to be wrong because if it's not, then we don't have a right to our property, and therefore it's the same as saying that slave being whipped was not wrong because the government said it was okay.
And the justification doesn't matter. Even if the master, the slave master, whether it's an individual slave master or a king, and I consider a king just another kind of slave master.
Sure.
Just one who has a purple cloak and a crown of jewels, but it's a slave master. He's commanding people to do things and punishing them if they don't obey if they don't comply. Or some government agency, it doesn't matter if the thing being commanded is a good thing to do or not.
Right.
I have no natural rightful authority. I have no moral right to come and point a gun to your head and say, Dave, you're going to exercise. You're going to get on that treadmill or I'm going to hurt you or punish, right? I don't have the moral right to do that. Mm-hmm. I can persuade you and encourage you, but I can't come force you, even though we could all agree that's a good thing. It's a healthy thing to jog a little bit on the treadmill. I don't have any right to make anyone do that, nor does anyone else.
And that applies on both sides. We like to look at the left and the things that they're trying to force. But if a Republican were to get elected president and say, you know what, I'm going to make a law that every single citizen has to start taking ivermectin, zinc, and a lot more vitamin D3. Right? Because a lot of doctors, and there's been a lot of studies that say you are less likely to contract COVID or see symptoms of COVID if you're taking those supplements and medications. Okay, that's just as wrong. That's just as much slavery. You can't force somebody to do something with their body. You can't interfere with somebody's body. Otherwise, all forms of that are okay.
And keep following that, keep pulling on that thread, right? If taking those things, taking the zinc and the ivermectin, I always mess that name up. If those things are helpful, we also know there are things that increase your risk of getting sick. So if you have diabetes, if you have congenital lung, if you have COPD, if you used to smoke, should we take the next step as well and come in and start to basically regulate and control someone's entire health regimen? Here's what you're going to eat, and here's what you shall not eat.
Yep.
And here's when you're going to exercise, and how you're going to. And here's all in the name of preventing communicable diseases and mitigating the health threats to them.
Right.
It is it's a form of slavery. And we've been taking steps towards that. I want to encourage someone to think, just use your imagination. I think freedom-oriented citizens would be well served to rediscover the power of the human imagination. Imagine things beyond what we have right now. Imagine yourself as a serf, a peasant in the 1300s, right? And the plague is ravishing the world, and you live on some little plot of muddy land that's owned by a king somewhere in Europe. And that king commands what you're going to do. Here's what you're going to plant, and here's how you're going to live, and here's what I'm going to take from you. I'll leave this much so that you guys can eat it, but I'm going to take care, and you're going to do all these things or be punished. It doesn't matter if he adds at the end, and that's for your own good.
Right.
It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right. And yet we have this view today that adding that little statement at the end, that's for your own good, somehow gives some people this moral authority to lord over others and command their lives.
Or they say, not only is it for your own good, it's for everyone else's good.
Right.
So you don't matter. Your property doesn't matter because you're only here to serve the good of everyone else, which is even more problematic, right? Because then you get into the ideas, go back to the ideas of slavery. You could make that argument that people need cotton. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm violating that slave's natural rights by making them, by forcing them into the field to pick cotton. Yeah. But it's for the greater good. We need people to pick cotton because we need cotton to do all kinds of things.
We need clothes.
Right.
People need clothes.
We need clothes. They were making paper out of cotton. They were doing huge parts of our lives were reliant on the cotton industry.
One of the examples, this kind of goes to this sort of big point of today, whenever the latest progressive program is trotted out. It could be AOC's Green New Deal or anything, or the moratorium on evictions or something else. It doesn't matter the details. They trot it out, and then the program or the proposal is always accompanied by experts, policy wonks. You're going to they come on to CNN and MSNBC, and they write pieces for the New York Times and telling Americans, oh, here are these good benefits that are going to result. And part of what I want Americans to start realizing, it doesn't even matter if those benefits are true or not. A lot of times what they say the benefits are going to be, they're just lies.
Right.
They're not actually going to happen. But even if they were true, that still doesn't give someone the rightful authority to command others, to violate their property, to control their liberty. And one of the examples that has come to my mind, and I think I like it because it kind of plucks our emotional cords. Throughout most of human history, around the world, arranged marriages, that was a very common practice among many different people. Very common. Legalized arranged marriages. You didn't get to pick who you're going to marry. The village elders or someone, here's who you're going to marry, and you're going to have children with that person, and you're going to do that. And you got punished, or you were banished or exiled if you didn't want to comply with that. Now, I'm very confident that some social scientists could do a study on the benefits of arranged marriages. What if it happened? What if it turned out that over a long period of time, arranged marriages were accompanied by lower drug abuse, lower suicide rates, right? Better physical health, blood pressure, lower rates of diabetes. You could think of all kinds of things, right? And the point is, even if someone tried out the benefits, and I bet there are some benefits to arranged marriages, that doesn't give anybody the right to control who someone else marries.
Yeah. And with arranged marriage probably means no divorce. Right. You've been forced to do this.
Right.
So I mean, we talk all the time about the benefits of having a full family unit, right? Yeah. A child raised with a mother and a father present, generally the statistics show. So I just proved in literally one sentence.
When people talk about traditional families and traditional marriage, that's a really traditional way of doing marriage, legally forced arranged marriage. Right. And there are very low rates of divorce.
So,
And so that's the big point, right? Even if some kind of arrangement, some kind of force, some kind of control over property and liberty has a good benefit or 10 good benefits, that doesn't give anybody else the moral authority to come and take your property and control your liberty.
well, I want to finish on one other point, because I did bring this up earlier, and I think it's an important thing for everybody to realize. And this is sort of off the slavery topic, but more on the developing, I want to call it an oligarchy that's happening in the United States. For all of the comments by the left, from all of the comments from the Joe Bidens and the Andrew Cuomos and the Nancy Pelosi's and the Rashida Tlaib's and the ideas of fairness and equity and Elizabeth Warren talking about taxing and all of that, what has been the result? We have seen this now over the last year. What has been the result of all of these moratoriums on rent not having to be paid? And you can't evict people. All these people can't afford to the upkeep. They still have to pay their property taxes. They still have to pay their utilities. They still have to pay all of the expenses that go along with maintaining it, but they don't have to take rent in. Or their tenants don't have to pay rent. People can't afford it. So what do? They put it up for sale. And there has been one company in particular who has more cash than almost every other company in the country, BlackRock. And BlackRock has been going in and they're buying every single property.
Is BlackRock a big business? BlackRock. Is BlackRock a big business?
Huge.
So if I was asked the question, who loves this moratorium?
Big business.
Big business, right? It's good for them.
Right. So what's happening is they're buying all of this up. They're going to, they have the capital, they have the finances available to them to allow people to live there rent free for the time being. But they're also creating an increased value because they're shrinking available property. They're driving up costs of homes. They're creating wealth.
They're going to end up with a kind of monopoly, a quasi-monopoly on rental properties.
Right.
And like all monopolies, it comes from government policies. It's the result of this moratorium policy.
So that was going to be my final point. Do you think somebody's in Joe Biden's ear right now saying, "Hey, you should extend this"?
I know what we need to do.
I'll make a donation to your campaign if you extend the moratorium.
BlackRock. We need to check and see, does Hunter Biden sit on the board of directors and getting $100,000 a month, gig from BlackRock? It would not surprise me.
I'm going to make a really inappropriate joke. He likes White Rock, not Black Rock. Or he only sits on boards where he can't speak the language.
That's right.
I mean, but the point is there is no doubt about it. There are people who are saying to Joe Biden, "Hey, we're going to keep donating to your reelection campaign, or to Kamala Harris.
You betcha.
We're going to keep donating to your future election campaign.
You extend
but
those
you have
evictions,
to extend those moratoriums because this has been good for us. Our business is growing because of this."
And that points to another big problem, and we'll talk about this in more detail at another time. But the subject is, when you create a big, sprawling, progressive regulatory state that can control all these kinds of things, it incentivizes a kind of lobbying and corruption. And the only way to get rid of it is not passing more regulations and more laws. It's scaling back the regulatory state, getting government control out of these private areas.
And let the market do its thing. And
that means the solution to these problems, the real solution, comes from the idea of liberty, from the American idea.
Right.
And that's why that American idea really needs guardians, protectors, more than ever before. And that's what we do with the Vino Veritas Society.
And we will continue to. We're also, just a reminder to everybody, we are continuing to try to grow this. And we are trying to expand into new cities and new states and new towns all across the country through this Leather Apron Club that we've talked about. And anybody who wants more information on that, it's on our website. I hope to go check it out. We want more guardians. We want more people.
We're going to be getting together September 23rd through the 25th in Black Hawk, Colorado. Seats are
not Black Rock, Black Hawk.
Black Hawk, that's right, Black Hawk. There's no rock involved. Someone tell Hunter. We're not talking cocaine here. And there are very limited. This is going to be small. We're all going to get to know each other. We're going to spend time together, and we're selling spots right now. So if someone's interested in joining us, go to our website. There's an article right there, right? If they scroll down,
Scroll down to the commentary section.
Modern Leather and Apron Club, all the details are in there. We've also sent out some email blasts and newsletters recently that have had that information in there. Contact us and come join us in September.
And we will continue to be the guardians, no somos custodies.
Yep. Till next time.